What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about aging? Is it wrinkles, grey hair, a decline in energy and cognition, or is it just a state of disease in general? Well, one thing we can all agree on is that aging is the agreement we've all had to sign in exchange for life. But the good news is, modern day advancements in science and technology have enabled us to redefine aging as we know it. Perhaps in the decades to come, we're destined to find the key to unlocking biological immortality by growing old without getting elderly. A new era of living ageless, enjoying health span as a prolonged and standard way of life.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for a really exciting discussion about the science of longevity. I'm Josh, and I am a content producer, which means that I write videos, I shoot videos, sometimes I edit videos.
And I'm Fujan. I'm a biohacking health coach.
So Fujan has told me many times what that means, but many times it has gone over my head. So for you guys at home, and also for myself, Fujan, what is biohacking?
Josh, biohacking is just a do-it-yourself science experiment. It's basically hacking your body to understand your bio-individuality and changing the environment inside you and outside you to optimize your health, boost energy and vitality.
Yeah, so in the new year. In fact, I think this is going to be posted in the new year. So now I should be in the gym, and hopefully Fujan's going to be helping me with that in January. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, why not? Now, we're delighted to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Steele, a computational research biologist and the author of the book Ageless, The Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. Andrew has completed his PhD in physics from the University of Oxford, but then he realised that ageing was the single most scientific challenge of our time, and that's when he decided to switch fields into computational biology. Now, apart from being a scientist, Andrew is also a writer, and in his book Ageless, he reveals just how close we are to an astonishing extension of our lifespans. He has also written for the Wall Street Journal, Sunday Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian, and The Wired magazine. And if you haven't yet had the chance to read Ageless, I highly recommend getting yourself a copy to support you in your longevity health goals this new year.
Andrew, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. The pleasure is definitely all ours. And as Fujan's saying, we understand that you've got a PhD in physics, but decided to move over to biology in essence, right, for aging and longevity. What made you think that that's the biggest challenge facing humanity at the moment?
I actually changed career, and this is going to sound a little bit strange. I changed career because of a graph. And that graph, it's quite a simple graph. It's just how old you are along the bottom and your risk of death up the side. And so we all know that older people are more likely to die, right? That's obvious. But just how much really shocked me. So let's try and put some numbers to it to make sense of it. I'm currently 38 years old. What that means is my chance of death this year is about 1 in 1,000. And I quite like those odds, because what that would mean, let's imagine that could extend out for the rest of my life. I'd live into my 1,030s on average. Obviously, unfortunately, that isn't what happens. Our risk of death as humans doubles about every 8 years. And what that means is you can take that small number and you can double it and you can double it and you can double it. Eventually, it starts to get very big very quickly. So if I'm lucky enough to live into my 90s and unlucky enough that we haven't made any medical breakthroughs, any breakthroughs in the biology I'm interested in the intervening time, my risk of death in one of those years will be about 1 in 6. That's life and death at the roll of a dice. And there are two ways to look at this graph, right? You can either look at it as a human being and think that's terrifying. I've got this exponential wall of mortality coming at me. Or you can look at it as a PhD physicist and think, wow, what is this sort of fundamental ticking clock inside all of our biology that means that we have a dramatically increased risk of death, which is driven by a dramatically increased risk of all kinds of diseases, of cancer, of heart disease, of dementia, all these different things also increased basically exponentially with age. And if we could understand that change in our biology, could we do something about it? And so I decided I'm going to leave physics, go into computational biology, so that's sort of the nerdy data analysis side of biology, and try and work out what we can do about it. And that's how I got where I am today.
Just a little follow-up question. Having such a deep understanding of physics, has that helped you? I mean, of course, from a research perspective, I'm sure it has, but is there physics involved? And this is coming from someone who's a creative major at university, right? So is there physics involved in biology and the aging process?
I think what's really changed about biology in the last sort of 10, 20 years is it's turned from a very sort of wet, squishy lab science. That's still really important, by the way. You know, full respect to lab biologists, I wouldn't know where to start. But it's turning into a data-driven science. And so that means that although the physics isn't sort of directly applicable, there are a few places, like if you're designing a new kind of microscope or you're trying to analyze the structure of the tiny molecule molecules inside our body. There's a lot of physics in that. But also the sort of biology I went into was essentially data analysis, because now we've got sort of DNA sequence data, we've got all kinds of tests, we've got hospital medical records. That's the sort of data I was analysing. We've got machine learning tools that we can do the analysis with. I think that's the sort of really exciting place, because once you get to a point where a science can be understood numerically, can be understood with data, you can really start to get insights that are just much harder to do if you're sort of describing on a narrative level, looking at stuff down the microscope. It's brought us a long way, but I think this data revolution is really what's going to transform biology.
That's incredibly educational for me. Thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Amazing. And I think aging is not really something that people get excited about, but certainly it seems like from your point of view, it's an exciting time. Where do you think that intersection is between physics and biology then?
Yeah, so you might think that, that was quite a depressing reason to change career. I found out there was this huge risk of death coming at me and everyone else on the planet. But actually what was really making me optimistic, so I was finishing up my PhD around 2011, and there had been a few really exciting breakthroughs. One of the ones that I think really showed me that this was something that was possible was in 2009, a paper came out and it showed for the first time that we could give a drug to a mouse, and we could actually wait until the mouse was really quite old to give it this drug, and we could essentially slow down the aging process and make them live longer, but also make them live healthier. So you weren't just dragging out the sort of frailty, the disease at the end of life. These mice were doing better as a result. This is a drug called rapamycin, and we can talk a bit about that if you like. But this is just a really cool, exciting result. So the big picture is we've got a drug here. They gave it to mice that were aged about 20 months, and mice, obviously anyone who's ever had a pet mouse knows they do not live as long as human beings. They live maybe 2 or 3 years in the lab. So you can give it to a mouse in sort of mousy middle age, frankly. This is 50, 60 years old in human terms, and you can still increase how long and how healthy they live. And so we've got this sort of combination of this huge health issue, the fact that risk of death, our risk of disease is increasing, but we have this whole variety of new interventions, drugs, various other kinds of treatment that might be able to slow down that change. And that's just really exciting as an idea.
It definitely is exciting. I actually saw you talk about the same research study on, I think maybe Russell Howard and a few other places as well, and it really captured my interest in the field. Of course, I'm now working for a healthcare, a self-healthcare company as well, right? But it is actually incredible to think that I might live beyond the 80, 90 years, and that's an idea that I got also from your book, Ageless. If I hadn't read it, what can I expect? Tell some of our watchers at home what to expect from your book.
I think the key insight actually is exactly like you say. I think a lot of us think we're going to live to 80 or 90, and that's just the norm. That's how it's always been. But actually, if you take a bit more of a historical perspective, that is a really new phenomenon that most people can expect to live to old age. Because if you go back into sort of the middle of the 19th century, so that's the 1800s, then what you find is that the life expectancy in most parts of the world, even in what we currently think of as the rich countries today, was about 30 or 40 years old. And so we've, in that intervening time, essentially doubled what it means to be human. So this 80 or 90, there's nothing magic about that figure. It's just, what current human life expectancy is. And what's really exciting, I think, the reason I hope people will pick up my book is that understanding some of this science shows you that we're on the cusp of a new longevity revolution. So getting from sort of 30 to 40 years of life expectancy up to 80, a huge component of that, especially early on, was things like infectious diseases. Because what that 30 or 40 years really masks is a couple of different things. The first thing is the huge toll of infant mortality. So a huge fraction of kids just didn't make it to the age of 20. It was basically tossing a coin whether you'd make it through your childhood and make it into early adulthood, and that's primarily because of infectious diseases.
But of course, medical practices as well, right? We didn't know to disinfect instruments, etc. Right? Surely that's a massive impact.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. There's this, vaccines and antibiotics and sort of medicine is super important, but actually just the really basics of, making sure that sewage is kept separate from fresh water in towns and that sort of thing. This sort of combination of social, of medical factors were what conspired to make childhood infectious disease, and actually adulthood infectious disease as well, just much, much less likely, much, much less deadly. And then maybe in the last sort of 50 years, we have started eating away a little bit at the sort of things that kill older people. So we've got much better cardiac care, for example, for heart disease. One of the things that really struck me when I was doing a bit of research for the book, CPR, so that's where you see this in TV films all the time, people like pumping the chest of someone else to try and restart their heart. That was invented in the 1960s. Like, can you believe how recent that is?
Really?
Given how fundamental it is. In fact, I was watching a German drama. I live in Germany. I'm trying to learn a bit of German, so we're watching some German TV set in 1929. And this girl's heart stopped, and a guy started giving her CPR. And I was like, darling, saying to my wife, this isn't actually historically accurate because CPR hadn't been invented in 1929. It's remarkable how recent a lot of these things. Cancer care has dramatically improved as well. A lot of these cancer drugs just simply didn't exist 50 years ago. So we have started to improve life expectancy for older people too. But I think the revolution we're really on the cusp of, and the reason I decided to write a book is that we're coming up with these medicines that don't just treat an individual disease. They don't just restart your heart if your heart stops, like CPR. They don't just potentially cure you of your cancer or get rid of your tumor. They can slow down the aging process that caused you to get the heart disease, that caused you to get the cancer in the first place. And so these are preventative medicines. That's the first exciting thing. They stop you getting ill in the first place. But also they could potentially treat all of these age-related conditions at once.
So that's really interesting. In relation to the book again, you talk about the 10 hallmarks of aging, right? Can you give us a bit of a summary of that as well? I mean, you kind of already started to do that, right? And maybe unpack a few that you think are most relevant to us today.
I think one thing that's really changed about our understanding of aging is that in the last 10, 20 years, we've started to drill down into what the causes of the aging process are. So what are the fundamental, the biological, the cellular, the biochemical mechanisms that cause us to go from having this 1 in 1,000 risk of death in youth to having obviously a much, much higher risk of death as we move through life. And this has been broken down in one of the most highly cited papers ever. This is a scientists cite papers. They refer to them when they think they're useful. This is, I think, the most highly cited paper ever in aging biology, called The Hallmarks of Aging, came out in 2013. And what this does is it breaks the aging process down into these component parts. And these affect all different scales of our biology. Actually, in my book, I have one more hallmark, because there's been a bit of a development in aging biology in the intervening 10 years. So if you try and break it down into these 10 components, it starts at the very, very smallest, most fundamental things, the actual molecules that are inside our body. So obviously, everyone's heard of DNA. That's the instruction manual that tells our cells how to behave, tells us how to turn from a single fertilized egg inside our mother all the way into this sort of fully functional adult human, hopefully fully functional anyway, with loads and loads of different cell types, eye cells, brain cells, liver cells, all these different cells doing what they're supposed to do. That instruction manual can accumulate effectively typos. So you imagine it's made up of 4 chemical letters in this case, A, T, C, and G. As we go through life, we can get these sort of typing errors because our cells can divide. They can misread the DNA as they copy it during the cell division process. You can get environmental things like toxins, things like ultraviolet light hitting your skin can damage the DNA in that way. An accumulation of these mutations of the damage to the DNA, we think, is one of these hallmarks of aging, perhaps the most fundamental. And the thing that I think this is most commonly associated with is cancer, because cancer is essentially a disease where you accumulate enough mutations in your cells, and that cell then it takes the brakes off. When it should be stopping dividing, it carries on dividing, and that can form a tumour.
So that sounds just like when my mum would always say, put your sun cream on because you get a sunburn and the sun's going to give you wrinkles. And I've got Irish skin anyway. I'm going to get wrinkles. But that it's nice to know the science behind that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually learning a bit more about aging has made me much more sort of bullish on the sun cream for a couple of reasons. I mean, skin cancer's bad.
You're quite fair anyway, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to stay that way because actually, I think that what the tanning process shows is that's your skin responding to this threat. The sun coming from the external environment. Obviously, skin cancer is a bad thing. That's something that's well known. We also know it damages the collagen, the proteins in your skin, which is probably one of the reasons it leads to wrinkles to such a degree. But also, we now understand that this damage to the DNA might have a sort of broader aging consequence as well, which is that if I got a random person, aged 50 or above and took a sample out of their skin, I would find that there basically isn't a single unmutated cell. And the reason is that when you get one of these bits of one of these mutations, it doesn't necessarily have to actually be cancer, but what can happen is it can encourage that cell to divide more and more times. And if you imagine the cell's got a mutation that causes it to divide more, this is evolution happening on the scale of your skin. And so that cell's going to divide more, it's going to outcompete the other cells that haven't got this mutation. And so what you find is that most of your skin, by the time you're aged over 50, is covered in these mutant clones. And that's not what a young person's skin looks like. And we don't know exactly whether that contributes to the aging process, and if so, how. But your skin is your largest organ. It's really fundamental. It's your barrier between your innards and the outside world. I'd rather not have those clonally expanded mutated cells all over my skin. So I think that's just another reason to sort of preventatively try and stop that from happening by slapping on some sun cream.
Oh, you've actually scared me.
Andrew, there seems to be a lot of talk and excitement around the gut microbiome. I mean, nowadays, they're saying that the gut is literally in charge of so much of what's happening inside our body. And I guess in the area of kind of aging, longevity medicine, can you share some insight into the latest research? What are your thoughts on how the gut responds to longevity?
So the microbiome, this is actually the hallmark of aging that I added while I was writing my book, because it wasn't in the original 2013 paper, but it was in an updated Hallmarks of Aging paper that came out last year. So you heard it here first. It was in my book before it was in the scientific literature.
Love it.
The microbiome, so biome is just the name that scientists give for the organisms that live in a particular place. Micro, obviously very small. And we think there are we know there are loads of bacteria living all over us, all inside us. So your skin has a microbiome, your mouth has an oral microbiome, but perhaps the most studied and maybe the most important is the microbiome inside your gut. And this is mainly found in your intestines. These are bacteria that effectively live off the food that you eat. And they have a variety of different functions. And they seem to be, one of the reasons we think they're super important is just because there are so many of them. So there are about sort of 30 or 40 trillion cells in your body. So that's 30 or 40 followed by 12 zeros. It's a really big number. We think there are about the same number of bacteria in your gut as there are cells in your body. So they're clearly a really important component part. Sorry, you're going to say something. That's the reason
I was going to out myself as an absolutely uneducated person, I'll say. And so that means that bacteria must be much smaller than cells, right?
They are, yeah,
They
exactly.
are.
So that's definitely the logic you've got to go with there. It makes sense.
Yeah, you've outed me there, Andrew. I was hoping that you'd skate over that little look that I made.
Yeah, so obviously bacteria are a lot smaller, but these huge numbers of microorganisms are clearly doing something, right? They're clearly in there. They're not just passengers inside your human body. We know that they're responsible for breaking down some of the things in food that you can't break down, so they can provide chemicals to your body. They're responsible in part for suppressing pathogenic bacteria. So if you get food poisoning, one of the ways that food poisoning is overcome is your gut microbiome fighting back against it, trying to re-establish normality. And we also know that they communicate with your immune system. Now, you might think this is slightly weird because your immune system normally tries to kill bacteria, tries to remove the threat. But actually, your gut microbiome and your immune system have this sort of collaborative relationship. And it seems to be really, really important for maintaining immune health as well. So what happens when we age? We know that as you get older or as you get certain chronic diseases, things like diabetes, what you can find is that the diversity of your microbiome goes down. And so that means that more aggressive species tend to become dominant and you get fewer, so you get a lesser variety sort of is what's going on. Now, the real question, and this is still an outstanding question in the field, I would say, is which direction does the causality go? So is it the fact that your microbiome is decreasing in diversity that's driving some aspects of your aging? Or is it because you're aging, perhaps because your immune system is getting weaker, all these various things are going on, the linings of your guts, the properties of those change as you age as well? Maybe that's what drives the changes in the microbiome. And actually, this being biology, I suspect the answer is probably a bit of both. So what gives us any confidence that this might be somewhere where we could intervene that might have a causative effect on the aging process? I think the most fascinating experiments were done in an animal called a killifish. Now, this is not a normal lab organism. Obviously, a lot of people think of lab rats, lab mice, that sort of thing. A killifish is a new model organism that's primarily used at the moment for aging research. And the reason is they have a very short lifespan. So these are fish that are found in what are called ephemeral pools in Africa. And what an ephemeral pool means, obviously, is one that's not around for very long. So the eggs are laid in the mud, essentially. And when the rainy season comes around, the rain falls on these things, it fills up these ephemeral pools, and the fish, the clock is ticking because they've got to hatch from the egg, they've got to grow up, they've got to find a mate, they've got to mate with that mate, they've got to lay some more eggs before the pool disappears. And that means that they've got a very short lifespan. They've got a very short life cycle. And if you have them in the lab, they tend to live about 4 months. So that's obviously much, much shorter than a human, but it's also much shorter than a mouse. Mice, as I said, live 2 or 3 years.
Which means that you can get through more research
exactly.
to go.
Because if you're going to research aging, you want an animal that doesn't take, if we're going to do a gut microbiome experiment on humans, we're going to be sitting around for 80 years, absolute nightmare. So you want to do some sort of proof of concept in something that lives a bit shorter. So what they did was they got some of these killifish, they grew them up in the lab, and they waited until they're about 2 months old, which doesn't sound very old, but that's sort of middle age if you're a killifish. And then they gave them this really potent course of antibiotics, which basically wiped out their whole gut microbiome. And so they've got an empty gut. And then they did one of two things. They reinfused those microbes, but they either gave them the microbiome of a middle-aged fish, so essentially they cleaned it out for a couple of days and then gave them the same microbes back, or they gave them the microbiome from a younger fish. And what they found was that those killifish, the middle-aged ones who'd had this infusion from the younger fish, they lived longer. They lived about a month longer, actually, which, when you only live 4 months, living 5 is actually rather impressive. And they also found, obviously it's hard to check for sort of the frailty and cognitive performance in a tiny little fish, but they saw that they darted around the tank more, which they thought was sort of, an indicator of delayed frailty. Again, these aren't dragging out the sort of the frail part at the end of life. It seems to be keeping them healthier for longer. And so this is a really interesting piece of causal evidence that suggests that if you manipulate the microbiome, you can also manipulate the aging process. So obviously more work still needs to be done, but that's such an exciting result. I hope we can scale up to mice, scale up to humans, and start to understand a bit more about what's going on.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I read actually in Dr. Will Bolshevik's book, Fiber Fueled, where he's also a gut microbiome expert. He was talking about this experiment where they'd done a similar thing to mice, where they wiped out their gut microbiome, and then these would be like obese mice, and they implanted the gut microbiome of a healthier weight person, mice, and then the obese mice was like losing weight really rapidly. So it's really interesting. But going back to the relationship between the immune system and the gut microbiome, autophagy seems to be the buzzword when it comes to kind of longevity. So many people, in the functional medicine space are, talking about intermittent fasting protocols, reversing disease in that way. But also there's not that much research around whether intermittent fasting is actually working in the way that we assume it is. What are your thoughts around this? How would you sort of say we should stimulate autophagy? Are there any drugs that are in development for it? What are your thoughts?
So it really does seem to be an important process when it comes to aging. And this is actually another one of the hallmarks of aging, is the accumulation of damaged proteins. So, we often think of protein as the thing you see on the side of a label when you're looking at the food. You've got the protein, the fat, the sugar, all these sorts of things. But actually, that sort of does protein a disservice. It's not just some block of nutrient. It's actually one of the most, proteins are the fundamental molecular workers. They're like nanobots that are inside our bodies doing all of the tasks inside our cells. They're also fundamental to the structure of our bodies. So things like collagen, we've already mentioned, that's a crucial structural protein, not just in your skin, but also your bones, your blood vessels. There are loads of places where it essentially holds your body together. So these are really, really important molecules. And those ones that are inside our cells actually are recycled very, very often. So they typically only last for a few days before getting gobbled up in this process called autophagy, and then recycled into new proteins, sort of fresh ones that haven't been damaged anymore. And the problem is that as we get older, this process of autophagy can get less and less efficient. And so one of the ideas is that if we can boost that autophagy, maybe we can improve the lifespan and the health span of animals, and hopefully, of course, of human beings. And the reason that we originally started thinking about this were some experiments that happened a surprisingly long time ago. So this was back in the 1930s. There were some experiments done with rats looking at something called calorie restriction. And the idea was that you fed the rats substantially less. This isn't just a diet. This is like eating 40% less for their whole lives, but being really careful to make sure that while they were eating less, they were still getting all the vitamins, the minerals, sort of micronutrients that they needed. And this is sometimes called calorie restriction with optimal nutrition, or CRON. And what they found was that the rats that were eating far less than their compatriots who could eat what they liked, they lived a lot longer. And again, as is sort of my recurring theme here, they weren't just dragging out the frailty, they lived healthier for longer as well. So when they did a little tiny sort of rat autopsy at the end of the experiment, they found that the rats had died of very much the same things as their sort of litter mates who could eat what they wanted, just they'd live 50% longer still. So that's a really exciting result. And it was hypothesized.
50%?
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
Do you think that that's transferable to human beings? In your opinion, and of course we don't have any evidence of that
Unfortunately,
yet.
Probably not. And the reason is that there's the effects vary in size hugely. So you can make a nematode worm, a tiny little sort of millimeter long worm, live, I think, 300% longer with calorie restriction. Mice, I think you can get about 50%.
Is there a correlation to the size of the organism?
Maybe. When
the complexity of the body?
Yeah, we're
perhaps?
not entirely sure. So it might be that there's a correlation, unfortunately, with lifespan. So, for example, one of the hypotheses as to why this calorie restriction effect happens is, imagine you're an animal out in the wild and there's a famine. What you need to do is, you don't want to have kids during that famine, right? Because if you have kids, they're going to grow up in this world where there's not enough food. They're probably all going to die. You're not going to pass on your genes. You've put all this energy into creating these kids. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. And so the idea is that maybe you hunker down, you sort of reduce your aging speed, for example. That would mean that you can survive for longer. You can maybe live out the famine and have kids, in the next season when the food's a bit more plentiful. And if you're a rat or a mouse and you only live, 1, 2, 3 years, then that could be a really big deal. If you have a famine for one season, that's a really important thing. And so you need to extend your lifespan in order to wait out that famine. But imagine now you're a human and you live, maybe 60 years if you survived your childhood, of course, as we just discussed. Then it's not so important. It's not such a huge fraction of your reproductive lifespan. So maybe for that reason, it's not as evolutionarily significant. We've done experiments in monkeys, which are about as close as we've got to people. And what we found is that, to cut a very long story short, that it seems as though if you eat a roughly healthy diet, then by the time you then add calorie restriction on top of that, it doesn't seem to be anything like such a large effect. There's enough in those monkey experiments to keep calorie restriction nerds debating for months. So I won't go into the full details of that, but it seems as though it gets... Maybe it's something to do with size, maybe it's something to do with complexity, maybe it's just an evolutionary thing depending on how long you live. It does appear to get less effective as you get to the scale of humans. That said, we have got some human evidence, which is there was a study called Calorie. It's an acronym for something completely tortured that I've now forgotten, but it's a classic science thing where they try and make the sort of what it stands for fit the word. And they tried this for 2 years in humans, and they found, firstly, it's just incredibly hard to stick to. But those people who were able to stick to it, they cut back their diet by about 12% in calories this time. And they did seem to get healthier over that period of time. So they did loads of blood tests on them. And by and large, those things went in the right direction. The only trouble is, not those side effects. Not only are you hungry all the time, people reported that, you might think you get used to it. You might think the hunger goes away. That doesn't unfortunately seem to happen. There are also other side effects as well. So they report feeling cold all the time. It can have an impact on your sex drive, which might be a good thing for some people, but, obviously depends on your preferences. They also had a couple of people who dropped out of the study because their blood got very thin. So they got this problem called anemia. Some people's bones thinned. This was just a small number of people. But again, you sort of maybe want to be doing this under medical supervision. It's not, maybe don't try this at home. So that's the evidence that we got for calorie restriction. The challenge with fasting is that we've got less evidence still. There's some argument that maybe some of the results that we've seen in calorie restriction experiments actually are sort of fasting by the back door. And the reason for that is, imagine you're a mouse. So mice are nocturnal, and that means obviously they're active during the night. And if you're doing this experiment on calorie restriction on mice in the lab, unfortunately, PhD students, who are the ones who normally feed the mice, are diurnal, i.e. active during the day. So the way this feeding normally happens, the mice that are allowed to eat what they like, they obviously just have a big pile of food. It's there all the time. There's nothing to worry about. But the mice who are on the calorie restriction, what happens is the PhD student goes in at the end of their work day, which is the beginning of the mouse active period, the mouse night. And so what you do is you put in your amount of food that the calorie restricted mice are allowed to eat. Now these mice, they wake up, they're calorie restricted, they are starving. And so what are they going to do? They're going to chow down on all that food. Maybe they eat it in the first hour. That means they then fast for 23 hours. And if you're a mouse...
Oh, so it's not a good enough experiment because humans, if we were going to fast and have calorie restriction, we would still probably adhere to a breakfast, lunch and dinner and spread that energy intake out.
Yeah, well, that's the question. And to what extent is it that concentrating the calories in that single period of time, is it the calorie restriction itself that's causing it, or is it the timing of the eating? And if you think about a 23-hour fast for a mouse, if you or I didn't eat, we'd probably survive about 3 weeks. But if a mouse doesn't eat, it only survives about 3 days. It's obviously much smaller. It's got a much faster metabolism. So a 23-hour fast is like it's like you or me fasting for a week or something. So that's hardcore, I think is the word. Yeah. So it's really not obvious how you transfer these results to humans. There have been some studies on intermittent fasting. One of the ones that was looking at weight loss. Actually, so my wife and I started trying something called time-restricted feeding, which is, so there are a load of different protocols. Time-restricted feeding is the one where you try and only eat for a 6 or an 8 hour window during the day. And this is actually super easy to do. As a student, I would often skip breakfast. And so it's quite easy. You imagine, you have your first meal at noon at lunchtime, then you eat, make sure you finish your evening meal by 8 p.m. That's not too challenging. That's pretty doable for a lot of people. And we were actually doing this for about a week. We're thinking, this is fine. This is going quite well. But literally at the end of that week, a study came out where I was looking at using this for weight loss. And what they'd found was that people who did this, they got some slightly overweight people, they gave them either time-restricted feeding or just a sort of regular diet, quote unquote. And they found that the people who'd done the time-restricted feeding, they did lose weight, but they seemed to lose more muscle mass than fat mass, which is a bad thing. When you're losing weight, you'd ideally lose fat and maintain that lean muscle mass, which we know is really important, for your general health and for how you age. And so it's... that convinced us to stop, actually. So we did it for 1 week, then that study came out, and then it was straight back. Yeah, exactly. Good timing, hey? So we just need more human studies, frankly. There's something interesting going on here. The ideal scenario, I think, for me would be to not have to worry about what I eat, but have a drug that mimics the effect of calorie restriction. And so to go back to autophagy, which was how this question began, there's obviously a lot to talk about on this topic. If you do one of these calorie restriction experiments on mice, but you remove a gene that is essential for autophagy, what you find is that the calorie restriction doesn't work anymore. And so clearly from that experiment, you think that autophagy has something to do with the effects of calorie restriction. And so the idea is that we could give a drug that would enhance autophagy and hopefully allow animals to live longer and healthier. And actually that drug I already mentioned is a drug called rapamycin. That is one of the best autophagy enhancing drugs. What we really need to do is get that from, we've demonstrated that it can extend mouse lifespan, keep mice healthier for longer in loads of different conditions. It's one of the most reliable life extending drugs in mice. It also works, by the way, in loads of other organisms, which isn't always the case. So it works in yeast, which is the single celled fungus we use for brewing beer and making bread. It works in these nematode worms I mentioned. It works in fruit flies. It's really like surprisingly universal.
So what's stopping, is there anything halting its progression at the moment? I know that you've spoken a few times about funding to the industry and what have you. Is that the core problem?
I think funding's important. Clinical trials are expensive because, if you want to try this out, you want to try it in potentially a few hundred, a few thousand people. The other thing that's really challenging about rapamycin is that when you talk to a doctor about it, the reason this drug is prescribed at the moment is it's as an immune suppressant for someone who's had a transplant. So, for example, if you get a new liver, then what will happen is that liver's been donated by someone and that person's cells aren't exactly the same as your cells. And so there's a risk that your immune system will attack that new organ. And, essentially that's an incredibly deadly immune reaction that can be really serious. And so rapamycin is normally prescribed to reduce the strength of your immune system. And so when a lot of doctors have heard about rapamycin, they hear about it in this context and they're like, why would we give a bunch of old people an immune suppressant? This sounds like an absolutely stupid idea. I think that the thing that we need to communicate about this is actually, although it is an immune suppressant, it has quite significant side effects when given at those doses. The doses that people think it will help with longevity are actually much, much lower. And it might be that rather than giving the drug continuously, we pulse it. So we might give it for a week and then not for the rest of the month. We might give it for one day a week. There are various protocols that people are using out there in the wild if they give it to themselves off label. We just need to do the trial. And there are, again, it's frustrating how piecemeal the human evidence is. There was a drug company that tried to develop a drug that targets the same molecule in our cells called mTOR that rapamycin targets. But they actually didn't use rapamycin itself. They used, as I say, a different drug. And they found that they could improve the immune response in older people to a vaccine. And that's really counterintuitive, right? Because we're giving a drug that's normally given as an immune suppressant, but it turns out either at much lower doses or this different drug, it can improve immune responses in older people.
Is that similar to the way that vaccines work, right? Like sometimes you're given a version of the virus.
So actually what we think is happening here is when you give it at a high dose, it clogs up this protein called mTOR, and that stops the cells from proliferating. And a really key process that the cells, your immune system has to be able to do is to proliferate. So you got in your immune system, say you get infected by a virus or say you get challenged by a vaccine, they're sort of quite similar processes in a way. Your immune system has this whole sort of variety of different cells which can target different enemies. And so this, you find this one cell that absolutely nails your COVID vaccine, for example. It's perfectly matched to destroy that spike protein, which is what the vaccine contains. Then what that cell needs to do is divide loads and loads and loads of times to create an army of immune cells to fight off the vaccine or to fight off the actual COVID infection that you've got. And so that ability to proliferate is really, really key. And if you give it at a high dose, rapamycin stops that process of cell proliferation. And that's because mTOR is a really important protein within the cell. It has a variety of different functions. But what we think is that when you give it at a much lower level, it encourages the autophagy, potentially making people healthier, potentially actually improving immune function, but it doesn't suppress that cell division. So that means that when the immune system does need to sort of, suddenly expand in numbers in order to counter a threat, it actually might be better because those immune cells have been, they've had some of their defective proteins cleared out by the autophagy, but it doesn't slow down that process of division. So it really is, this is just a classic example of why medicine and biology are fascinating but really hard, because you can give the same drug at a different dose, and as far as we can tell, it just has literally the opposite effect. And I think, communicating that to doctors who've been seeing this prescribed primarily as an immune suppressant is a really, really tough sell. So I know a scientist who tried to do this during the COVID pandemic. She suggested doing a clinical trial in a bunch of people in care homes to see if we could give them rapamycin and improve their immune response to hopefully improve their response to COVID. But when she tried to get this past the review board, past the doctors who would have been administering the drugs, they were like, what are you crazy? Giving an immune suppressant to a bunch of 90-somethings during the middle of a pandemic? Right. What are you doing? And it's just a real challenge because obviously doctors haven't seen it prescribed in this way to communicate that this could be something that could be really, really worthwhile for aging.
For sure. And it's really fascinating. And I think virology is an area that gets a lot of funding. for vaccine development, but it's interesting your take on actually seeing what other medicines can support immunity, perhaps from a prevention point of view.
I would actually say, just to jump in, there's this common perception that certain areas of science do get a lot of funding, but even virology, even vaccine development is chronically underfunded. So if you look at Operation Warp Speed, which was an absolutely gigantic injection of cash that the US government gave to try and accelerate the development of COVID vaccines, it's about $20 per American. And that's like our single biggest push ever to create a vaccine. And using that comparatively tiny amount of money, we were able to create vaccines within 12 months of the virus having been discovered. This really incredible result. And so, if you think about that as an American, so as us here in the UK didn't really contribute that much in the same way, would you have paid, let's imagine, another $20 for that vaccine to be available even one day sooner? Like, I absolutely would have done. And probably if we'd doubled the funding, it would have been quicker than a day sooner, right? So I really think that when you view science funding through this lens of how much does it cost per person and what would the potential benefit be of increasing that money, although say virology has more funding than aging biology, it's actually still very, very small in the scheme of things.
Fair enough.
And it seems, it seems absolutely nuts that if there's a possibility for me to extend my life by 30, 40, 50%. Why wouldn't the powers that be, let's say, and the people with the money in their hand, surely they want to live for longer, right? So why are they not? It seems crazy to me.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. And actually, if you look at the funding for aging biology in the US, it's about $1 per American. And you just think aging causes 85% of deaths in the US, because if you add up the cancer, the heart disease, the dementia, all of these things, it's by far, most people make it into old age, and that's by far the majority cause of death. So it's wild to me. And I think that the reason is, and this is actually fundamentally the reason I wrote the book, is that people aren't aware of this science. If you're a politician and you're pulling the strings in terms of science funding, you might have relatives who've died of cancer, you might have relatives or friends who've died of heart disease, but you don't join the dots and think, oh, it was the aging process that caused those diseases in the first place. And getting that understanding out there, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think the same applies. I'm often baffled by, imagine I was a billionaire. Unfortunately, I'm not.
Well, I was about to say, forget the politicians for a moment. They've got a job to do, right? But the billionaires, surely they understand that through the money that they have, they're extending their own lives. I'm sure they've looking at medicines for themselves, transport, whatever it might be. I was about to go into sci-fi stuff, but I won't. Whatever it might be, why wouldn't they fund something like this? It seems counterintuitive.
I think it's primarily lack of awareness, because I think from the handful of extremely wealthy people I've spoken to about this, they're just like you and me. Like, they haven't necessarily been informed about this stuff. They just happen to have enough money that they could actually move the needle in terms of the research. So I think what we need to do, again, is just get the word out, because once these people understand that, you can't take that with you. Like this is what you're alluding to. Like, if I had $1 billion, I would spend 995 million, like maybe more, right? on this kind of research, because what am I going to do with all that money? And obviously it wouldn't just, because the other thing is, this could be an investment. Because if you think about an anti-aging drug, say you develop a drug for cancer, it's for a specific kind of cancer. There's going to be a handful of patients with that specific variety, that specific kind of cancer. Those are the people you can help. Super important, by the way. Cancer research I'm also in favour of. But imagine instead you develop a drug that slows down aging. The market for that drug is every living human, because all of us are aging. And so that means this is potentially the biggest industry ever. And yet, people are sitting on the sidelines and not investing. Partly that's because I think we need to do some more basic science to get things to the point where they are investable.
So Andrew, the small amount of money that I have in my bank account, where should it go? What shares and stocks should I buy in this industry, do you think?
I think for small time investors like you and me, the best thing to do is probably just...
No, sorry, not small time. Tiny investors like myself, yeah.
I think the best thing to do is stick your money in an index fund and allow the market to decide. Because honestly, the problem with biotech, and this is the fundamental problem with science, right? It's super, super unpredictable. If you're wealthy and you can invest in 100 biotechs, one of those biotechs might make an absolutely, whacking amount of cash and pay back your own original investment. But for small time chaps, like you and I, unfortunately, we haven't got the ability to spread our investment across such a broad portfolio. And so, it's just too high risk. And I think this is fundamentally actually why, as well as hopefully attracting, wealthy investors into this space, we also need the government funding, because that then means that we can spread the risk across the whole of society. And if you think about developing a vaccine for a minute, there was a possibility that $20 might not have got anywhere. Those vaccines might just not have worked. We got lucky, essentially, with COVID. And so what you need is, we just need to put more money together collectively, and particularly with basic research. You just never know what's going to work. Companies are unpredictable. Basic research is a whole nother animal. And what you need is the scale of a government. Imagine we invested in 500 potential anti-aging therapies. Even if 499 of them don't work, that 500th one suddenly nails it. And that means it massively reduces healthcare costs. So that's going to reduce costs for governments.
A massive buzzword here in the UK at the moment for the strain on the NHS since the beginning of COVID, and to be fair, for a decade beforehand as well, right? So yeah, it kind of solves economic crisis as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the strain on the NHS is just a classic example. Nobody would think, shouldn't we invest our funding into ageing biology to try and help the strain on the NHS? And to be clear, it's not going to help in the next 2-3 years, and obviously there's a critical crisis going on at the moment. But in the longer term, what are the costs on the NHS? It's basically older people. My wife worked in the NHS as a doctor, and what was really remarkable to her, when I first met her and started talking to her about this idea of treating aging medically, she thought I was crazy. But it doesn't matter what ward she rotated round, whether it was cancer, whether it was fractures, most of the people on those wards were older people. And you realise by far the majority of healthcare spending happens in the last few years of your life, and that's because the way that we treat medicine currently, we wait until you're ill and we try and solve the problem then, rather than investing in prevention. And there's a variety of different methods we can choose. We should try and improve public health as well, but I think one of the key things that's going to reduce healthcare costs in the long term is investing in the ageing biology that allows us to develop the drugs that will hopefully keep people healthier for longer and keep them out of hospital.
Andrew, you've shared so much with us about rapamycin. What other drugs are currently on the market that can either be repurposed, or are there any other clinical trials happening for longevity at the moment?
So frustratingly, there aren't any clinical trials currently happening for longevity itself. There are lots of drugs that might be able to slow down the aging process, but the way that this normally works is that there are trials for specific diseases where we know that that particular aspect of aging is a problem. So I think we'll talk later about senolytics, which are these drugs that kill aged cells in our bodies. But currently, all the senolytics trials are for specific diseases where these senescent cells appear to be an issue. And that's because it's just very hard to do a clinical trial for aging. You have to get a very large number of people, you have to follow them for a very long period of time, and you have to see if they get diseases less often, if they die less often in the group that gets the drug versus the group that gets the placebo, the sort of sugar pill that doesn't do anything. So it's a really, really challenging thing to do. It's often very expensive because you've got so many participants in that trial. One that we're really hoping will get started soon, and there have been a number of sort of false starts with this, is a trial for a drug called metformin. And metformin is a drug that's actually, some people listening to this might well be taking. It's one of the most commonly prescribed drugs in the world. It's a diabetes medication that helps control your blood sugar. And we've been prescribing it in the UK since the 1950s. So it's really, a drug that we've got a lot of idea about how safe it is, about all these different, aspects of how it works in terms of side effects and stuff. But really interestingly, it might, in addition to its ability to control blood sugar, help with the aging process too. And I think the most compelling evidence for that was actually a study that was done in the UK in 2014, I think. And it was a medical record study. So they were looking back at what people's medical records, people's medical history. And they were looking primarily, the study was to try and determine the difference between metformin and another kind of diabetes drug called a sulfonylurea. Don't worry, there will not be a test at the end of the podcast. So they got a group of people taking the metformin, a group of people taking this other drug. But to be sort of belt and braces secure about the results of this, they also got a control group of people who weren't taking any drug or weren't taking either of these two drugs. And the reason, of course, they weren't taking those drugs is that they didn't have diabetes. Now, what do we know about people who don't have diabetes? They're normally healthier than diabetics. And the reason is that diabetics, they're often overweight, which is can be a contributing factor to the diabetes. The diabetes can then go on to cause various health problems. So it can cause cardiovascular problems, amongst other things. And so it's, you'd expect those people who are non-diabetics to live longer than the diabetics taking metformin. But what they found was, firstly, metformin is indeed better than sulfonylureas, which is why it's considered the first-line therapy for sort of type 2 diabetes, the diabetes you get with older age. But secondly, they found that the people who weren't diabetic and weren't taking metformin actually lived a shorter life than the people who were diabetic and were taking the drug. And so the potential theory here is that maybe the metformin, as well as controlling the diabetes, is having some broader effect on the aging process. Because this really counterintuitive result that people with a disease are living longer than quote-unquote healthy people. What's going on there? The challenge is that because this was a backward-looking study looking at people's medical histories rather than looking into the future, there could be other reasons that this effect was seen. And I think a really good example of that is just very obvious, actually. It's the amount of care that you get from the medical system. So imagine you are a diabetic, you're going to be going and checking in with your doctor, every so often.
So other things are caught sooner.
Exactly.
And you're kind of, there's an eye on you at all times,
exactly.
right?
So, say your blood pressure starts going up, your doctor's going to notice it 6 months later, stick you straight on a blood pressure drug. Whereas, a lot of people are walking around with high blood pressure, especially older people. They just don't know. They don't realise they need to be on a drug, and therefore, maybe that's what's going on. It's nothing to do with the metformin. So what we really need is a proper randomised trial where we get a bunch of people. And so there's actually this trial called TAME, which is Targeting Aging with Metformin. It's another one of these tortured science acronyms. And the idea is that they're going to get a bunch of people between, I think, the ages of 60 and 79. They're going to give 3,000 of them, half of them metformin, 1,500, half of them something else, that an inactive pill that looks the same, tastes the same, etc., so they don't know what they're getting. And then they're going to follow them for 3 to 5 years. And the way they're going to check if it slows down aging or not is to see, do the people who get the metformin, do they get cancer later? Do they get heart disease later? Do they get dementia later? Do they die later? And they're going to have this sort of composite of all these different diseases that we know are aging related and see if the metformin can slow down that onset. And because this is a randomized trial, because it's not that, whether you have diabetes or not that determines whether or not you get the drug, it's literally random, that is the nature of randomization, then the only difference between those two groups is going to be the drug. And so whatever else they're doing should be roughly equivalent.
5 years seems like such a short time to look at, what is it, 6,000 people. If they're middle-aged, between the ages of sort of 50 to 55, you might not see that much difference, no?
Yeah, and I think that's so. The idea is they're going to have people between ages of 60 and 80, and the odds of dying.
Right, okay.
The odds of dying in that area. So the number off the top of my head is that when you're 65, your odds of dying are 1%. So that means you've got a 1 in 100 chance of dying. When you're 80, your odds of dying are about 5%, so 1 in 20 per year. And what that means is if you're watching, a few thousand people of that age bracket, then some of them are going to get cancer, some of them are going to die.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be a minority of the people that you're following in the study, honestly. But that's why you need such big numbers. And so then that's how you determine whether or not the drug works. The sort of longer term plan for this is that hopefully we're going to develop what are called biomarkers of aging, so tests that can ascertain your biological age. And then, rather than having to wait for years and have huge numbers of people to spot tiny numbers of events, we could then measure your biological age before the trial starts. We could give you some drugs for a few months or some other treatment, and then we could measure your biological age at the end. And there are 2 really big advantages to this. Firstly, the trials are a lot shorter. I guess there are 3 advantages actually. First, the trials are a lot shorter. Secondly, you're not literally waiting for people to die, so that's sort of nice bonus, I guess, as well.
A bit more positive.
But the other thing that's really interesting about that is that it means that every single person in the trial contributes data. So in that idea of the metformin trial I was just describing, if you stay healthy, then you're not contributing any data to that trial. You're just carrying on being healthy. Who cares?
Yeah.
But if you've got an epigenetic clock or some other biomarker of aging, then literally every person has an age before and an age after. And so that measurement, it just means the statistics are a lot easier and the trials can be not only a lot shorter in time, but also a lot smaller. That means they're going to be a lot cheaper.
You're going to get a lot more data, right?
2 questions. If metformin is slowing down the aging process, would you say that insulin resistance is one of the main drivers of aging then?
It could be. It's really hard to distinguish cause from effect because it certainly seems that becoming insulin resistant is age related. It seems to be driven in part by a process called inflammation. So another of the hallmarks of aging is dysfunction of your immune system. And what inflammation means, so actually it's very important to distinguish between 2 different types of inflammation. There's acute inflammation, and this is the sort of good kind of inflammation in a sense, because when your body gets confronted with a threat, that could be, it could be an infection, it could be a wound, your immune system recognizes the threat, rushes to the site of that wound, heals it, rushes to the site of that infection and clears out the bacteria, clears out the viruses, whatever it is, but then crucially dies away as quickly as it built up. And that means that, that inflammation has gone away. However, as we get older, there's a process called chronic inflammation. And what that means is that your immune system is essentially constantly a little bit paranoid. It's always looking over its shoulder. There's a sort of low-level activation all of the time. That seems to drive a variety of aspects of the aging process. And one of the things it does seem to drive as well is this resistance to insulin. So insulin is the hormone that tells your body to absorb the sugar out of the blood. And if that resistance happens, then your body gets less good at absorbing the sugar out of your blood and your blood sugar stays high. The challenge then is and this is the real, this is why biology and medicine are hard again. These processes are all super interconnected.
This is where the gut microbiome comes back in.
Yeah, so the microbiome could be related to it as well. In fact, one of the things metformin does is it seems to affect your gut microbiome. So maybe the way it's having an effect on aging could be partly mediated by that. The other challenge is that having high blood sugar has a range of effects on the proteins inside the walls of your arteries. So it can affect the collagen. They can get something called glycated or glycosylated, and that can cause age-related changes. Fundamentally, we know that the cells can also change their metabolism in response to this higher blood sugar. So it's all a sort of tangled, complicated mess. And I think this is a really important thing to take away about the aging process in general. Although we've been talking about the hallmarks of aging, and there are sort of these 10 categories of things that change in your body. Actually, I think the better way to think of them, rather than as a list, is that they're some of the key stations on an underground map. And what we really want to do to understand aging isn't to just know what the key stations are. We also need to know what that map looks like, which hallmarks affect which other hallmarks, how are they connected together. And once we've sort of managed to get that underground map elucidated in a bit more of a clear way, that's when we're going to get the really clever anti-aging interventions. It might be that they don't target any one specific hallmark, but they actually somehow stabilize that network of processes that are happening inside your body. So I think that's sort of the ultimate goal of aging, is to understand that network and intervene in ways that are clever. And what that means is that, when you ask, is X caused by Y? I'm unfortunately going to give you this long, complicated answer, because everything's connected to everything else, and it's really hard to know what's the cause and what's the effect, because you can often flip around that story, and it's you can make a good case that it makes just as much sense. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
I'm fascinated by how research is moving more towards understanding how health is actually integrated, but also things like glycation we can now measure with DNA testing. And there's also the DNA epigenetics testing, which is some people say a good test to kind of measure how fast you're aging. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I think that as a research tool, it's really valuable. I think on an individual level, it's less useful at the moment. I'm super excited about the sort of long-term trajectory of this field, but let's rewind and talk about what on earth this thing is before we start passing judgment. So an epigenetic clock is what they're often called. This is so named because epigenetics is a sort of layer above your DNA. We've said DNA is the instruction manual that allows your cells to be what they're going to be. The real interesting question is that most cells in your body have literally identical DNA. So if it's an eye cell, if it's a brain cell, if it's a muscle cell, these have very different functions. They look very different under the microscope. You wouldn't have to be an expert to distinguish that they were at least different types of cell, even if you didn't know which was which. So how is it that cells with the same genetic code can have such different, can I use a science word here, it's phenotypes, but such different behaviors, such different appearances, all these different characteristics? And the answer is epigenetics. So this is like, if you imagine DNA is the instruction manual, your epigenetics is sort of scribbles in the margin, it's highlighter pen, it's saying, use this gene, you're a muscle cell, you really need this gene, but you're not an eye cell, so this eye cell gene, just turn that off and leave it inactive. Right. And so this is sort of this layer on top of your DNA saying which bits of DNA to use.
Does that come back to gene expression?
Yes, exactly. So what it's controlling is this idea of gene expression. Expression is just essentially a word for turning on and off, though obviously you can turn the volume up and down on various genes. That's what the epigenetics is controlling. So what we've noticed is that you can look at particular epigenetic marks, and one of the simplest is something called DNA methylation, which is where you stick a little thing called a methyl group on the DNA, and we've noticed that there are certain places in the DNA where that changes in a very predictable way with age. And so you can look at the methylation all over someone's DNA, and by looking the original epigenetic clock, although there are millions of these sites in your genome, you can look at just 353 of them, and you can work out how old you are to within a few years. Now, that might not sound like that amazing a bit of technology, because we already have something called a birth certificate, which allows us to do this substantially more accurately.
And also those TikTok filters that tell you your age, right?
Well, this is a fascinating one. So actually, one of the best biomarkers of aging at the moment might be how you look. So there was a fascinating paper that came out in 2009 where they got a bunch of people to rate the perceived age of some photographs of other people, right? And some of the raters were experts. They were like geriatric nurses who were really used to dealing with older people. Some of them were just, regular people off the street. And what they found was that how old you look, if you look older than your chronological age, so how many candles there are on your birth ticket, the standard age that most of us are familiar with, then these patients were at higher risk of disease, they were at higher risk of dying than the patients who looked chronologically, had a lower perceived age. And so what this really shows us is that the same kinds of processes that cause the aging of the insides of our bodies also cause the aging of our outsides of our bodies, our skin, our hair, and so on. So that's a sort of another point in favour of this idea of aging being a coherent process that we can intervene.
Well, I hate to say that sounds like common sense.
Yeah. It's nice to have.
If you look young, you're probably quite young. No?
It's nice to have biological backing for that, though, and I think. But you're absolutely right. I think all of us know someone who's in their 60s who is still, running marathons or whatever it might be. They're still, acting like someone biologically younger, and yet someone else might even be a sibling of theirs who's the same kind of age, but they look wrinkled, they look tired, they look haggard.
Yeah. So my dad's obsessed by how old he looks and has been for years and years and years. But it's only recently that he started to look after himself properly, really, like diet and exercise, etc. So he's going to be very, very, very happy to hear that if he looks slightly younger than his age, he may even live a little bit longer as well. So thank you for that.
So
and Dad, you're going to be happy with that one.
So I think that's the sort of intuitive side of things, right? And actually, people are working on AI models that will take an image of your face. There's been another one that was developed on a 3D scan of your face that can determine your biological age. And these epigenetic tests are just another tool in our armory. And as I said, we already know how old we are to much more accuracy than these tests can actually provide. But it also opens up a question. So imagine I'm 38, as I said, imagine you measure my epigenetic age. Imagine I'm epigenetically 42. Now, is that just like an error in the measurement? Is that just noise because this isn't a perfectly accurate technique? Or does that indicate that somehow biologically I'm older than the number of candles on my birthday cake? And conversely, if I do an epigenetic test and I discover I'm 34, is it party time? Can I say, fantastic, I'm biologically younger, I'm super healthy, like I'm doing all the right things, check me out? The answer is that in the intervening sort of decade of research since this was discovered, it does appear to be the case. We've developed better and better epigenetic clocks that can look at things like your risk of death, your risk of disease, looking forward now rather than looking backward at how old you are. So there's clearly something going on. But these work at what's called at a population level. And the crucial thing is that we don't know what interventions mean if they change your epigenetic age. So what on earth am I talking about? Imagine you and me are the same age. It's a bit of a stretch, right. But let's imagine we're the same age.
It's not too
and
bad.
I come out as chronologically 42, and you come out as chronologically 34. Now, what that would mean is I could say with reasonable confidence that, unfortunately, with my old epigenetic age, I'm probably going to get ill. I'm probably going to die sooner than you with your younger epigenetic age, even though chronologically we might be the same age, right? However, what I can't say is, imagine I look at those results like, oh my God, this is terrible. There's death coming at me. I've got to do something about this. So maybe I start an exercise program. Maybe I start taking a multivitamin. Maybe I start, maybe I take rapamycin off label, even though it hasn't had a proper clinical trial yet. I'm not recommending doing that. But I try something to try and sort out this epigenetic disaster that's going on.
Can
inside
you just
my
say, don't try that at home?
Yeah, exactly. Do not try that at home. So I take some kind of intervention, and then 3 months later we come back. Oh, great news! I'm epigenetically 34. I'm the same age as your epigenetic age was when we first did the test, right? We do not know whether that means anything. It could be that if I'd done nothing, then my epigenetic age would have dropped down. We also know that if you repeatedly test people over the course of a few months, their age can jump around quite a lot. And in fact, for example, if you get an infection, your epigenetic age often jumps up by quite a large amount and then jumps back down again when the infection is over. So I think we're not yet at the point where we can give health advice based on this. However, as we understand more about it, as we start to identify these sites, not just because they're correlated with age, but perhaps we can identify those that are causally related, things that are actually related to the, fundamentally what's going on in the aging process, these things are going to get better and better. And at some point, hopefully, we're going to be able to use them for individual health advice.
So would you say it's probably more valuable to then start tracking things like your HRV, your VO2 max as a better way to measure longevity?
I think so. Yeah, we can obviously get loads and loads of data out of wearables these days. I think the things that are most valuable to track from that, probably your resting heart rate is one of the most important things.
69.
Very good. So the sort of
my Apple Watch told me.
The quote unquote normal range is between 60 and 100. There are actually some people are a little bit lower than that, depending on how healthy you are. The lower tends to be better. A really good thing about the resting heart rate is it's very accurately measured, because particularly when you are resting, obviously that's the definition of resting heart rate is you're supposed to be resting. That's when the devices are best at doing the measurements. So if you find the way that they measure your heart rate, you've probably noticed there's a little flashing green light on the back. That flashing green light can be confused by things like changes in ambient light levels. If you're running, your watch can be moving up and down your wrist a little bit, and so that can confuse the sensor as well. But actually, when you're resting, that's when they're best at doing that measurement. And I've got a few videos about exactly how this works.
We saw you running on the treadmill.
Yeah, I'm so so glad that we've segued nicely into wearables, because I was really keen to talk to you about that video that you created where you were comparing a few different wearables. We don't have to go into that right now, but what I'm really interested in is whether you have heard of or know of like the new generation of technology that's coming out, whether it be wearables or other things that we should be looking out for as a way to track our own health and hopefully prolong our lives.
So I think the most important things you can do right now, resting heart rate is a really good measure. I think the other thing that I find really compelling, which again you can do with current generation wearables, is to look at what Fitbit calls active zone minutes.
I love that one in the gym.
Yes, it's got a variety of different names depending on the brand of wearable that you use. But what they do is they break your heart rate down into these so-called zones. I think that's sort of over-scientification in some ways, but basically what you're looking for, the standard advice, if you go on the NHS website, if you go in a lot of public health places online, will tell you should be aiming to get 150 minutes of sort of light exercise a week. So that could be a brisk walk, or 75 minutes of intense exercise. That might be a run, it might be a swim, it might be a cycle, however you like to get your heart rate up nice and high. And what the active zone minutes concept tries to do, it gives you one zone minute for sort of low intensity exercise, like, as I say, like a brisk walk, and two of these zone minutes if you're working a little bit harder. And what that means is you can sort of do the maths. It's not that complicated. You can either get 75 of the hard minutes or 150 of the easier minutes. That's the way that you can break things down. And I think that's a really good measure of, are you getting enough activity in a given week? There's no reason to see the 150 as a ceiling, by the way. You can carry on, exercising more seems to generate more and more benefits until you get up to like half an hour or above per day. It definitely seems to improve how long you live, how healthy you are. It can decrease your resting heart rate and so on. I think tracking it with the resting heart rate is probably the most useful. The other thing that I think we can't yet measure with a wearable that you can just stick on your wrist or stick around your bicep as some of these straps are put on or whatever it might be, is your blood pressure. There are some that are starting to claim that, but I think we're not yet at the point where they're super reliable. So actually the other thing I'd really recommend is that people get a blood pressure cuff and measure their blood pressure at home. There are a few different reasons for this. Firstly, it's really important that it's a resting measurement. And so that means you've got to sit down, take a breather for 5 minutes, stick your blood pressure cuff on. Often I find when I do it, even if I've been sat still for 5 minutes, the first measurement is often a bit on the high side. And so you can find that, take a second or a third repeat measurement, it can look a little bit better.
So also psychological sort of state is important there as well. So my stepdad is a PT, and that is probably doing him no justice at all. He's quite a well-educated person within fitness and recovery. Yeah, so I've had that blood pressure cuff on quite a few times. Whenever I've said I'm a bit ill, he's chucked it on me, right? And sometimes you can feel a little bit nervous because you might have a bit of pain somewhere. So yeah, psychologically that can have an impact as well, right? Because I found myself bit of anxiety, and he's like, oh, Jesus Christ, we better do that one again.
I mean, I remember the first time I consciously took a blood pressure measurement. It shows, this is something I've started paying a lot more attention to recently. I was working as a scientist at the time, and I was doing analysis of medical records, one of the key indicators of which was blood pressure. And I'd signed up for a new GP, so I went into the practice, and it was this automated blood pressure cuff. So you stick your arm into this massive machine, and it starts crushing your arm. Now, it's actually quite painful when you have this done.
I've had
And
that.
also because I was aware of what the healthy numbers were, which I hadn't really thought about before. Background in physics wasn't really something that registered. As a young man, classically, we don't engage enough with the healthcare system. This thing starts squeezing me. And I didn't realise the way a blood pressure cuff works, it squeezes up to a maximum pressure and then actually takes a reading on the way down. So I watched this number climb up to like 180 over, whatever it might be, which is a very, very high blood pressure.
Sure, yeah.
And I was thinking, my God, I'm basically
I'm going to
dead.
die.
This is the end of it. And then it starts going down again. And you saw that my sort of blood pressure came out as 130 something over like 90 something. Right. My heart rate during that time was like 90. My resting heart rate's in the 50s.
That anxiety through the roof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is a phenomenon more generally known as white coat hypertension. So you're in a room with someone with a white coat with a clipboard looking very official, doctor obviously. It can just make you nervous. Whereas when you're at home, you can chill out, you can get a nice, even measurement.
Oh, I was even nervous at home. Jeez.
Yeah.
Grow up, Josh.
But I think it's just so valuable to be able to get that measurement, and also just to be able to get that was the first time I remember having my blood pressure measured. I'm sure I'd had it done at some point before, but it's just so useful to get that data. You don't have to do it every day. You do it once a week, once a month, but just have that idea of what your blood pressure is, because high blood pressure is a silent killer. If you've got high blood pressure, you don't know. You can walk around, it feels completely normal. The first indication you get is you might have a heart attack, you might have a stroke, or there are a few sort of pre-signs. You can get damage to very small blood vessels. You can lose a little bit of your vision if a blood vessel bursts on the back of your eye. So you can actually have it spotted by an optician because your blood vessels start to sort of swell up a bit. But basically, unless you do the blood pressure measurement, you never know.
So with wearables in relation to that, I hadn't actually heard of technology that was doing that yet, that just slap it on your wrist sort of situation. Is that close? Or
Yeah, so there are a few
dubious?
watches that claim to do it. At the moment, I think you have to calibrate them about once a month, where you put on a blood pressure cuff, get the actual measurement, tell the watch what it is.
Right.
And what it does is, when it's
That makes
watching,
sense.
let's get a bit technical now, it's flashing its little light on your wrist. What it's looking for is the very subtle change in the colour of your skin. And because as your blood goes through your skin gets a bit redder, as you can imagine. And then as in the interval between heartbeats, it gets a bit less red. And that's essentially what that flashing green light is measuring. It's absolutely wild. But again, another video I made.
But that sounds like it can be quite inaccurate, right? I mean, we can have a change in colour for lots of different reasons.
So because it's looking over this short time scale, it's actually it's surprisingly accurate. So I made a video with my mate Steve Mould, who's a big YouTuber, and I went around to his place and filmed his face, and I was able to extract his pulse rate from this video of his face. So if you really enhance the colours in a particular way, you can pull out how fast someone's heart's beating just from a video of their face, which is a really remarkable thing. And it's shocking. It's shocking how easy it is. And actually, so that's what your watch is doing on your wrist the whole time. So what it gets this curve. It gets a little graph of essentially how red your skin is. It's actually how much green light is reflected off your skin, because obviously it's a little flashing green light. And by looking at every time you get a peak, that's a heartbeat. That's how the watches currently work. But what researchers have noticed is that the shape of that curve can tell you something about the blood pressure. And the algorithms are still in development. They're not quite 100% reliable yet. They're not as good as a blood pressure cuff. But it's going to be a really fascinating time when we can measure that blood pressure continuously.
The larger the peak, the higher the pressure, right?
I think it's actually more to do with the shape, like whether it's skewed a bit one way or the other. Because whether it's larger or smaller is actually related a lot to do with how much blood is near the surface of your skin. So, for example, you might find your watch, if you go out for a run on a cold day, often the heart rate is just total nonsense. Because your small blood vessels in your skin are contracting to try and keep you warm, then what that means is there's less blood near the surface, and that means that your wearable is less able to pick up on the.
Right. But if you're in the
Andrew,
gym...
what about people who have problems with circulation, thyroid disorders? How would it impact them?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think more research is needed. One of the things that I found out when I was sort of really doing a deep dive into the algorithms of these wearables, there's not a lot of research even on people of colour. And obviously, if you imagine you've got darker skin, it's going to be harder to spot those peaks and troughs in the changing colour. And there just isn't enough research done on this. There's also a lot of people have complained if you have a tattoo on that part of your skin, it's much, much harder to pick it up as well.
Oh, wow.
And so I really feel like we just need to do more work. And what's very frustrating actually is a lot of the wearable companies, they do this research internally, or they do the research but then they publish it in such a way as you can't fully understand the data. And so in fact, I remember finding a paper that Fitbit released about resting heart rate and how that changed among Fitbit users with age. And what they said, this is in an open access journal, which is so this is a paper that we can all view. All the data is available, apart from the fact that they put a little asterisk saying the algorithm we use to determine resting heart rate is a Fitbit proprietary algorithm. And as a scientist, you're like, well, without knowing what that proprietary algorithm is, actually, quite a lot of the ways these devices measure resting heart rate can be a bit inaccurate. So, for example, this is another thing I made a video about. Some of them take a measurement at night. And this is a really misleading measurement because the definition of resting heart rate is your heart rate while you're resting, clearly, but also while you're awake. And my heart rate can dramatically drop overnight. So there was one night I did an experiment for this. I was wearing a chest strap, which is like a much more accurate way of measuring my heart rate. My resting heart rate in the day, at that time I was a little bit fitter than I am now, was probably in the low 50s. But yet when I went overnight, there was a period of just probably 30 seconds when my heart rate went down to 32. I think it was 34, but anyway, very, very low. If I thought my resting heart rate was 34, that's like Tour de France level. I'm not that fit. I try and do a bit of running, but I'm not Bradley Wiggins. So clearly, if your Oura Ring, for example, actually there is a lowest heart rate value that it gives you. If you thought that was your resting heart rate, you would think you were super fit, but actually that isn't the case. So you've really got to be a little bit careful about what exactly these devices are telling you and understanding the measurements that your particular brand of device gives you. Because if they say it's done with a proprietary algorithm, what time of day is it being measured? Like another example of this I was wearing a Fitbit when I got COVID. My COVID infection a few years ago, and my heart rate while I was sleeping actually went up to 80 that first night I had COVID because I had a really bad fever just for that one day. But my resting heart rate actually climbed a couple of days later. And so you realise that Fitbit are probably smoothing their resting heart rate in some way, and it never got higher than 60 something. And so you're like, but that's clearly not true because I was asleep, which is when my heart rate should be at its lowest, and it was beating away in the 80s, which is crazy in itself.
I think you mentioned Apple Watch measures it only once every 4 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I did a little science experiment between my Apple Watch and a first beat device, which kind of sits around your chest with electrodes. And I was kind of more interested in HRV, but there was even differences between resting heart rate. So on my Apple Watch, it says 69 resting heart rate, might go down to 67, but on my first beat, it was a bit lower. And then on my Apple Watch, it says my HRV is 81, but on my first beat, it was saying 65. So it's quite a big difference for HRV.
Yeah, and I think HRV is even more challenging because there are loads of different algorithms by which you can measure it. So you can either... let's quickly rewind. What is HRV? HRV stands for heart rate variability, as you know, and what that means is it's the difference in the intervals between heartbeats. So say your heart rate is 60 beats per minute. That doesn't mean it's beating like a metronome once every second. Maybe it'll be 0.9 seconds, then 1.1 seconds, then 0.8 seconds, then it just changes a little tiny bit. And what we've noticed is that people who have a higher heart rate variability, so actually a less regular heartbeat, do seem to be healthier in various ways. So that sounds really counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
You'd want your heart to be regularly beating. We don't 100% know the mechanism, but I think the most plausible sort of hand-waving explanation I've heard is that your heart rate needs to be really adaptable. So imagine you stand up, your heart rate has to rapidly increase to account for the fact that you're changing your behaviour. There are loads of different ways. So in fact, your heart rate even changes when you breathe in and breathe out. Yeah. As you breathe in, your heart gets slightly smaller, gets compressed by the fact your lungs are expanding. So it has to beat more quickly to pump the same volume of blood. And so your heart rate is constantly tweaking itself for all manner of physiological reasons. And so you want that heart rate to be variable in order to account for all these tiny, tiny changes that are constantly happening inside your body. The challenge is that when I say my heart rate variability is X, there are loads of mathematical functions you can use to quantify. So, say you've got 10 measurements, some of which are shorter, some of which are longer. You could take the standard deviation, you could add them all together and do some. There are just loads and loads of different algorithms you can use. I think there are even dozens of these algorithms. I think
that's another thing that can just constantly change on a day-to-day basis, especially like if you have a lot of stress one week and then more relaxed and you're on a holiday the next week, your heart rate variability can really change. So it's not really like one figure that you can be like, okay, I'm good, because it can really change like the next week. If you're not managing your stress, it can just drop right down, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the real challenge that we have with that is, again, just a frustrating lack of human studies. This was first found out in patients who had recently had a heart attack. Actually, this was decades and decades ago when they were doing these experiments. And they found that patients who'd had a heart attack and then had a lower heart rate variability had a worse ongoing prognosis. And we know that this is really important in a diseased state. But what we don't know is, say you're quote unquote, basically healthy. Does a change in your heart rate variability from day to day, from week to week, what does that mean? It clearly does follow various changes. So there's a classic thing you'll see online is people say, I went out drinking one night and my heart rate variability overnight was absolutely terrible. So it clearly does respond quite rapidly.
I was going to say, I do feel like when I'm hungover, my heart rate is completely different the next day, right? It's,
Well, it comes back to that stress, isn't it? Your body's under that kind of stress response. It's trying to recover. And once it does, that HRV can go back up again, isn't it? Yeah.
And the real question is, is the HRV telling you anything that your throbbing head it's not already?
Well, in all fairness, I probably take an unadvisable amount of paracetamol in that morning, so the head's fine. The head's fine, actually. And I'm sat there thinking, why is my heart going? But then I have to remember, oh no, it's because drank too much last night.
It's fascinating. So there's so much content online just around, things like triggering hormetic stress. And I know you also mentioned mTOR really briefly, but how can you just kind of decipher between all the different myths and what's actually scientifically backed when it comes to longevity?
I mean, that's really hard. I actually find it quite challenging sometimes. If someone puts out something with, a plausible cellular mechanism, there is just so much biology, even though I've been working on this stuff for years and years and years.
And having the passion makes you want to explore it, even if, it hasn't got the scientific backing yet. It's, maybe if,
There's
right?
so many contradictions as well. Like going back to the intermittent fasting that we were talking about. I mean, there are doctors, who are very well respected in their fields, mostly in the functional medicine space, like Dr. Mark Hyman. I mean, they swear by the kind of these intermittent fasting protocols, but it could also be down to that calorie restriction, as you said. It's so hard to decipher. It's really, really difficult to navigate your way through it.
It really is, yeah. And I actually think, I often say, I think we'll have cured aging medically before we fully understand diet, because there are just so many variables. There's obviously, there's the macronutrients, the carbs, the fats, the proteins, there's the vitamins, all these different things. There's when you eat them, there's how much of them you eat, there's what ratio you eat them in. Like if you think about how many variables there are, and it's probably different from person to person, and it's probably different from age to age as well. So there's some evidence that restricting protein can be good for you. That's a bit controversial because obviously protein is really important for things like muscle building.
It's very controversial. Restricting protein,
But the theory is that, imagine this is beneficial. There are some experiments in animals that suggest it might be. Then it probably is. It probably would be beneficial then for younger people. But maybe as you get older, and preserving muscle mass is one of the crucial things once you pass the age of sort of 40 or 50. Then suddenly maybe you want to increase your protein again. So maybe it varies by age. I'm not suggesting anyone restrict protein.
But again, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because if as a young person I build lots of muscle, surely that serves me better in life. Exactly, right?
The question is, do you need that additional protein intake to build the muscle as a younger person? And we haven't done the studies to show
that's interesting, because I was actually thinking about this last night, funnily enough. Yeah. And I was thinking that you see in movies and it's kind of a cultural acceptance that that people go to prison, they get sent to prison, and they go to prison, they've got perhaps a not a great diet, it's a bit restricted, especially like decades ago, and they come out jacked, they come out really, really muscly. I'm thinking, but hold on, we buy all of these like protein supplements so that I can try and get 120 grams of protein in a day, and as you say, do I need it?
It's a great question, and I think again it's really frustrating. More research is needed. I think that some people. And the other question is, it depends what your goals are. I think if you want to get jacked, we know enough about strength training that clearly upping your protein volume is super important.
Sure.
I'm not super interested in being jacked. Like, I want to look all right.
No, you're cardio. You're cycling and climbing mountains.
So strength training is super important. So let's rewind a bit about that. Strength training is super, super important, especially as you get older, because when you pass the age of 30, you start losing about 10% of your muscle strength every decade. So it really does start to eat away. It's incredible. But we know that process is largely reversible by strength training. It's clearly, in large part due to the fact that older people tend to be less active. And muscle is super important. It's a hugely important metabolic tissue in the body, so it has all kinds of functions beyond simply picking stuff up. There's also the far more mundane idea that it's really important when it comes to not falling over. One of the really key drivers of ill health in old age is if you have a fall, you can often be in hospital for weeks and weeks. You lose a load of muscle mass because you're isolated in bed. That can then be the start of the beginning of the end, essentially. A lot of people die in the year after they've had a fall.
Yeah, it's going to be imperative to balance, right?
Yeah, so just having that muscle mass is super, super important. So definitely it is better to have more muscle as we go later into life. The real question is, if you don't care about being jacked particularly, strength training is still super important, but what is the optimal level of protein if you want to live a long time? And it might be the theory behind protein restriction. Again, I'm not advising necessarily that you go out and do this, but the theory is that it actually tamps down on mTOR, it increases autophagy, and thereby might slow down the aging process, for example. And so if I want to live as long as possible in good health, I want to maintain that muscle mass into older age, like where on earth do I draw this balance? And that's why I think we really need studies. And the challenge is that we need studies potentially in order to solve these diet kind of questions. We need studies that last a lifetime, because we know that you can sort of pull things out of the bag in much, much later life. There was a fascinating study I found where they gave a bunch of 90-somethings a strength training program. And after a couple of months of strength training, these people were able to lift more weight. They were able to walk further and faster. Like this, it's never too late to start is the really key takeaway.
I'm really glad you said that, actually, because I've had members of my own family that have started strength training or perhaps come back to it later on in life. And I've got to say, for everyone at home, it is fantastic for them. Game changer, 100%. So I'm glad you said that. Thank you.
Yeah, so no, I think that's really important. And the question is, like, if I was to try and design my life for optimal healthy lifespan, do I need to build muscle now? Can I put it off and wait a bit later? I'm just trying to stay generally healthy.
Your body can produce its own amino acids from carbohydrates and fats anyway, right?
I mean, there are some that you can't, and this is the interesting question. So there's something called an essential amino acid and something called a non-essential amino acid. And so some of those are able to be produced by your body, but others you have to get from your diet.
Yes.
And what's what's fascinating is that it might be that the amounts of these amino acids you can't produce yourself is one of the things that determines, we call it calorie restriction, but actually in the book I refer to it as dietary restriction. And the reason is we're not entirely sure what is being restricted. So there have been some experiments in the lab that have shown that if you reduce an amino acid called methionine, which is one of these ones your body can't produce itself, that seems to have similar effects to calorie restriction, i.e., the animals live longer, they live healthier. So we don't really know what aspect of diet it is exactly. And there was a really fascinating set of experiments that I do not know what to take away from, where scientists in UCL gave a bunch of fruit flies this exact combination of amino acids that was precisely balanced to the... So let's talk about DNA really briefly. In your DNA, the letters of that DNA, the A's, T's, C's and G's, code for amino acids. And so when your DNA is being read, it's essentially telling it how to assemble amino acids and turn them into proteins. And they gave these fruit flies amino acids to eat for their diet in exactly the ratio that they're found in the DNA. And they found that those fruit flies lived longer and could reproduce until later in life than fruit flies that have been allowed to just eat their normal, quote unquote, normal diet, which in the lab is sugar and yeast, and the yeast provides the protein. But obviously the yeast doesn't have those amino acids in the exact ratio that it appears in their DNA. So there's just, and again, you got the reason I say that we're going to solve aging medically before we solve diet. There are 20 amino acids. Even if you just wanted to try like 2 different levels of each of those 20, that's like so many combinations of foods. Yeah. And if you imagine we want to try more than 2 levels because we want to find the optimal value for this thing. And also that might change throughout the course of your life. It might change depending on your personal, your gut microbiome, as we were talking about earlier. We just don't know. And I think it's going to be, the best health advice. And I think the way to sort of distinguish the myths from the reality, the simple stuff is what we all know that we can do right now. I think most of us would benefit from eating a few more plants, getting more plant-based protein, eating more nuts, eating more legumes, and so on and so forth. I think we all know that we need to exercise more probably in the majority of cases. Strength training is super important. I think that's something that I neglect as well. Actually, it's something we really need to try and integrate more into our exercise regime because, it's quite unquote easy to go out for a run. It's obviously not always easy to go out for a run. You've got to find the time. You've got to have the energy to do so. But I think strength training is just a bit more complicated, a bit more involved. We don't necessarily know so well what we're doing with that. I think like sticking to those basics is by far the most important thing you can do. And I think what's often a myth in longevity is where these things are hyper specific. So it's like blueberries are a superfood, or take this one particular supplement and you'll live X amount longer.
Polarizing health advice.
Exactly. And so I think like most of us could get 90% of the way toward perfect health, or as good a health as we can currently say with any kind of evidence, just by doing the stuff that honestly most of us probably know we should already be doing.
I'm so glad that you've kind of brought it back round to giving some healthy tips for people at home. Can we just reiterate that again? What are your core pillars for health, perhaps?
So there's a chapter of health advice in the book, and number 1 in that chapter of different bits of health advice is do not smoke. If anyone is watching, listening to this, and they want to live a long time, smoking is the single worst thing you can do. It subtracts about 10 years from your life, and it's not as though you live fast, die young. It also subtracts 10 years of healthy life from you as well. So you're essentially accelerating the aging process by smoking. So the first thing you want to do is stop doing that. I think the next most important thing is probably diet. I think not being overweight is quite important, and obviously that can be a challenge to control your weight, but trying to find a diet that works for you, that allows you to maintain as healthy a body weight as possible. Trying to, as I said, eat more vegetables is probably something that most of us could do with doing. Meat seems in general to be worse for our health. Getting more vegetable protein, getting lots of variety into your diet, so lots of green leafy veg, lots of other kinds of vegetables, lots of fruit, all these different things are very, very beneficial. We've already talked a lot about the sort of ideas of calorie restriction and fasting. Not so sure that those are as important as just getting the basics right, again, in that same sort of way. Exercise-wise, I think getting your 150 zone minutes, so either your 75 minutes of hardcore exercise or your 150 minutes of slightly milder exercise, or some combination is super, super important. I think if you can go a bit beyond that, as I said, up to about half an hour a day of exercise, this could potentially be quite a few hundred zone minutes a week. We're still definitely seeing benefits. After that, the benefits are a bit harder to be sure of, mainly just because there are so few people who go for a run for an hour every day. You have to be quite blessed in terms of free time in order to make that possible. So we just don't really know what effect that has on lifespan at that point. But definitely like trying to get sort of a decent level of exercise, try and do a bit of strength training into that mix as well to make sure that you're preserving your muscle mass, especially as you get older. I think that's super, super important. And what I think that falls into, you might be listening to that and thinking, oh, yawn, you got through all this incredibly complicated aging biology.
Not at all, Andrew.
Eat well, exercise. Like, come on, there must be something more exciting than that. I think what really is more exciting about this once you understand the aging biology is that these things literally slow down the aging process. So, when you're exercising, it's really clear. You can feel your heart beating, you can feel your muscles working, you can feel your lungs going. It is benefiting your muscles, it is benefiting your cardiovascular system. You can imagine why that's the case. But we also know not only does cancer reduce the risk of heart disease, it also reduces the risk of some kinds of cancer. It also reduces the risk of dementia. So this is just this idea that aging is this incredibly connected, multifaceted phenomenon. And so by exercising, on a cold, rainy, wet morning when I maybe would rather not go for a run, you've got to think that it's literally slowing down your aging. It's doing this incredibly powerful. The sort of joke among medics is that if exercise were a pill, everyone would be queuing up to take it.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a bit more complicated to find the time to find the exercise that you enjoy. But it's really, really worth it just because of those wide-ranging health benefits. So that's the first thing, is the sort of basic health advice that we now know is literally slowing down aging. I think that makes it much more compelling. The next category of health advice I'd give is the stuff that by understanding the aging biology, it illuminates something that you wouldn't think was at all aging connected, and yet seems to be. I think the best example of this, my favourite example, is brushing your teeth. Now, obviously, there are a lot of good reasons to brush your teeth. You don't want to have.
Can I make a guess?
Yeah.
Is this about your microbiome?
It's an interesting question, actually. We don't entirely know. And one of the reasons some people might get more tooth decay than others is because of their oral microbiome.
Right.
So there are beneficial bacteria in your mouth. There are actually bacteria in your mouth as well that partly seem to regulate your blood pressure. So there's all kinds of connections going on here. But so the connection here that was actually first observed in studies exactly like what you're describing. It was noticed in the 90s that people with poor oral health, so more tooth decay, more gum disease and that sort of thing, seem to get heart disease sooner. And you might be thinking this is another classic case of correlation is not causation. Maybe there's a third factor here. And so, for example, you could think people who are more health conscious, they brush their teeth more, they floss, but they also eat vegetables and exercise and do all these other things that are good. Maybe that's what's helping them with the heart disease, not the fact that they brush their teeth. But what we now know, understanding a bit more about the aging biology, is that this sort of constant fight in your mouth, essentially, the reason that dentistry is so medieval in some ways, they literally drill out the bacteria, is because that is a fight that your immune system can never win. It's a constant fight between the bacteria in your mouth that are causing these problems and your immune system. And we already mentioned earlier this idea of chronic inflammation, the idea of inflammation that's constantly going on inside your body. So rather than having an acute inflammation where they go in, they solve the problem, they withdraw again, there's this constant sort of fizzing, buzzing of inflammatory molecules in your mouth. And we know that inflammation is a really big factor in driving things like heart disease, maybe even things like dementia. So we've done studies now where you find, if you look in the brains of people who have Alzheimer's disease, you find some bacteria that cause gum disease in those brains. And again, we don't know which way the correlation goes. It could be that those bacteria are taking advantage of the diseased brain in order to set up shop, or it could be that they are in some way causal of the dementia. And more research is needed, but nonetheless, this seems to suggest
there's a genetic element to it as well.
To microbiome, to the sort of
the oral health.
Definitely, yeah.
Some people are more prone to things like gum disease. I actually have a confession. I don't floss every day, but my dentist always tells me that my gums are like perfect. And I only go for like a hygiene once a year, as he recommends. But I know he says some patients go to him literally like every 3 months and they still have plaque built up. So I think, he always says to me...
It's a weird brag.
It's like a
genetic... It's a
weird
brag
all
for
the
sure.
things I could have had. I have good gums.
Well, it might be slowing down your aging process. So I wouldn't be saying don't be too dismissive. I think there is definitely a huge genetic component. There's a component in terms of your immune system. There's a component in terms of just how physically hard or porous your dental enamel is, so the sort of hard outer part of your tooth. And I'm unfortunately someone who's been blessed with not particularly great teeth, and it's remarkable that even though I take absolutely the best care I possibly can. I do floss every day. I use a water flosser. I use interdental brushes. Not all every day, by the way. But I've got the whole portfolio. I brush really carefully. I've got an electric toothbrush. I know exactly what I should be doing. But my dentist still recommends that I visit the hygienist multiple times a year. And it's like, what can I possibly?
How much
be
does it
doing
cost you every time you go to the hygienist?
Well, now I live in Germany. Thankfully, it's covered by health insurance.
Oh, I was gonna. Wow, I think that they're squeezing your insurance a little bit.
And I think this is one of the things that's really frustrating. Actually, is the lack of joined up medical care in the UK. There was this sort of bizarre political artifact when the NHS was founded that dentistry was excluded.
Crazy.
And why is it that is because we now know that our oral health is so connected to the health of the rest of our bodies. A really mundane example is just that older people tend to eat less fruit and veg, in part because their teeth are bad. So it's harder to chew an apple. It's harder to bite down on a piece of fresh fruit if your teeth aren't great. And so clearly it has this much wider effect on our health. And yet, in order to get the best dental treatment, you often have to go private in the UK, and that's just absolutely bonkers to me because it just isn't a joined up healthcare system at all.
Any other health tips for us?
I think the final health tip that I often give, and this might sound like a very strange piece of health advice, but bear with me.
We love strange.
I know, I'm
I think
excited.
The most important thing that you can do for your health, if you're already doing most of the basic stuff, you're already not smoking, you're already eating well, you're already exercising, you're brushing your teeth, blah, 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 is to campaign for aging biology. It's to understand a bit about this science, and it's to get the word out there. And the reason is, you cannot diet and exercise and brush your teeth to the age of 100 reliably. Like you have to get a bit lucky. You have to have the right genetics and so on in order to make it to these really advanced stages in good health. And so the single thing that's going to move the needle the most, if you're already trying to be as healthy as you can, is how much progress we make in this science in the next few years. And what that means is that we've got the ideas for these anti-aging drugs. Some of them are going to be available potentially in the next 5 or 10 years. This is in plenty of time for almost everybody who's alive today. And that means that if you can benefit from that first round of drugs, you can then live hopefully a little bit longer, carrying on with all the good health advice as well. And that gives scientists even longer to develop the next round of drugs and so on. And the crucial thing, we need to do the trials. We just need to up the volume of this research, because there are dozens and dozens of different ideas we have for aging. And so what we need to do is make sure that all of them get a sort of fair hearing. And those of them that work in mice that we can test in the lab, seem to work effectively in the lab, we can then do these big human trials in people. We can develop these biomarkers to make the future trials work more quickly. And I've already mentioned in the US, we spend about $1 per person on aging research, even though it causes the vast majority of US deaths, even though the cost of aging to the US economy runs into the trillions of dollars per year. We're spending about $400 million on the research that could actually slow down that process and improve people's health outcomes. So I think, although it sounds completely bizarre, I want people to read the book. I want people to learn about this science. I want them to chat with their mates down the pub about it. This needs to filter up to a whole load of different levels. We need voters to understand about this so they can vote for politicians who are going to fund the science. We need the politicians to know it's a thing that you can fund. We actually need scientists and medics to understand about this stuff as well. Because what I often found was that while I was working as a biologist, although I was working with some fantastic scientists with great degrees, great PhDs from amazing universities, they often hadn't had a single lecture on aging biology, even though it's one of the most fundamental processes in all of biology. And so that just really shocked me. And similarly, I already mentioned when I met my wife, she's a doctor, she's done her medical training. She didn't have a single lecture on it either. To the extent that you're taught about older people, you're told, they can be quite complicated patients because they're taking lots of different drugs. So you have to be really careful when you prescribe a new one that it's not going to interact with their existing drugs. They can have complicated problems.
So they're taught to solve all of these different problems, but not
the problem.
The problem.
Exactly,
I
not the
also
cause.
think another big problem is that when we're kind of campaigning for this funding, for this research, we're not really talking enough about the difference between health span and lifespan. And I think that's quite important, because there's lots of, these ethical implications around prolonging life and what about sustainability? What about our environment? What are the risks of living longer? But I think people should really understand the difference between lifespan and health span.
That's so true, because it's not a case of I'm going to be 100 years old and bedbound. The idea that we're talking about is that I'm going to be 100 years old and still have a quality of life.
Cost healthcare, not add additional costs to, hospital bills, and my children now taking time out of work and looking after me and me eating, more food. There has to be some kind of, standardization around this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that one of the challenges is when you talk to people about aging research, they think we're talking about prolonging the end of life, prolonging the old, aged part of life. Actually, I think this is incredibly implausible, because the reason is, the reason you die is because you're unwell. It's because you're frail. It's this variety of problems that you have that causes you to die. And so what I really care about, this word you mentioned, health span, it's how long we're healthy for. And we will probably live longer as a side effect because we're healthier. But the really crucial thing is keeping people healthier for longer. And that, as you say, has all of these benefits. And that means, we're going to have a world, hopefully, where people are free of heart disease, they're free of cancer, they're free of dementia for a longer fraction of their lives. And I just see that as a huge, huge win.
How would they die eventually?
Well, it depends how far we get. So, if you imagine we were to completely cure aging, what do I mean by a cure for aging? Is it a disease? I don't think we can even call it a disease. But what I mean when I talk about a cure is a risk of death that doesn't depend upon how long ago you were born. And so that means that you'd have a risk of death that, rather than doubling every 8 years, was constant throughout your life. When I talk about a cure, by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean I think it's going to be soon.
You're talking about immortality then, or correct me if I'm wrong.
Not, because you can still die as a young person. You can still get cancer. You can still have a heart attack.
Right.
You can still
just
get hit by a
can't.
bus.
So what you're saying is I can't die of old age, but any other disease or external factor might kill me.
Exactly, because there are still going to be buses to be hit by.
Yeah, but this is what I'm saying.
Post-aging
Then
world.
from in some regards, that is immortality.
Well, maybe
Put me in a vacuum and I'll live forever, is what you're saying.
So what is sometimes called biological immortality.
Right, okay.
And what that means is, as I said, this risk of death that's completely flat with time, because it's not real immortality, because you can still get hit by a bus. We could still have a global pandemic that takes a few of us out and so on. But I think the thing to focus on, and I'm sorry to say, it does slightly frustrate me when people say the word immortality. The reason
I'm not trying to wind you up, Andrew. I'm just trying to understand. That's all.
No, it's fair enough. And I think this is where a lot of people's brains go, and this is why it's a myth to be busted, right?
Right.
Because that's where when you talk about the idea of a cure for aging, you think about immortality. What I'm thinking about is people who are healthier for longer. I don't necessarily know that we can cure aging. I don't know if it's going to happen in the next 100 years, but it's what we should be aiming for. And the reason I say that is, if I had come in here and I was a cancer researcher and we were talking about cancer, and I said, I think we should cure cancer, you would not have gone, oh, we're talking about immortality now, are we? Or,
I think I'm understanding. Is it more now that you're saying, or you've always been saying, I should say, that aging can be a cause of other health conditions, and we need to cure aging as the cause of those health.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha.
And this is, this is clearly a hard concept to get your head around. Like, I can see you're doing it now in real time, and that's great. But it is something that needs explaining to people, because if you just say, oh, I want to cure aging as an atomized sentence in a vacuum, you sound like a bonkers tech billionaire who thinks we can just go in and like solve human biology and create this bonkers dystopian future where all the billionaires are living forever. And that is not what this is about. This is about keeping regular people healthier for longer and having a longer period of health before we get to the end of life. And that will mean that we live longer, but it's not going to mean that we all suddenly live to 10,000 years old.
Let's say we age without disease. Would you say it's the telomeres that will then still come and decide when is the end for you?
I hope that we're going to get to a point where our telomeres aren't getting shorter with age. I think, if we were to develop enough of these different therapies, the end point, the goal of aging biology, I think, should be to try and get people as close to that point early in life where you've got a very, very low risk of death as possible. Again, that isn't to say we're necessarily going to get there anytime soon, but the goal should be we can look at someone who's in their 20s or 30s. There's a sense in which that's our ideal physiology, because if you just go by risk of death, that is when your risk of death is lowest in your adult life. The actual lowest risk of death is when you're 10 years old, but I think most of us probably wouldn't want to go back to being a 10-year-old. But the point is, clearly our bodies in our 20s and our 30s, our risk of death is less than 1 in 1,000 for most of that period of time. Our bodies are phenomenally good at regulating themselves in this whole variety of different ways. We're at low risk of cancer. Our immune system is very good at spotting any precancerous cells. Our arteries tend to be pretty clean, so on and so on and so on. All these different things that our bodies are maintaining for us. So if we can just use the tools of biology and medicine to bring our physiology, not necessarily all the way, but a bit closer to that more youthful physiology where we're healthy, where we're still active, where we're still able to get around, and also where we're not diseased, that seems like a fantastic end goal to me. As I say, whether or not we'll get there, that's the big question. We need to put in the funding to try and get a little bit closer. But ultimately, our bodies already know how to be healthy. We just need to push them back into that direction to get them there.
Right. Honestly, this has been incredibly educational for me. So thank you very, very much. I know that Fujian's already, got lots of knowledge in this area, but I think
it's super informative for me as well, because I really struggle with all the conflicting advice, and I'm fascinated by all of this, but I always like to kind of link back things like physics to biology to chemistry and just kind of bring it together, because I feel like a lot of people will have one view and they get so fixated on it, and they're very good at selling that view, and they're very good at backing it up with clinical experience and other things. But I think it's important for us to make progress in this field is to kind of, bring in all the different elements, all the different areas of science, and see how, what impact we can create and where we can go with our research. I think I'm fascinated by all of this. And I think if all else fails, we can always upload our brains onto a machine and live forever anyway, right?
Well, I hope so, yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this new era of living ageless, and hopefully in the decades to come, maybe even sooner, we'll make some great breakthroughs. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Steele.
Yeah, thank you so much. An absolute pleasure.
Really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.